Hey, so welcome to another episode of the FLŌ TRIBE podcast. So in this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Patrick Owen, who is an ancestral health and functional nutrition expert. This guy really knows what he's talking about when it comes to nutrition. And what I really loved about his story is that not only does he talk the talk, but he's also walked the walk. And what I mean by that is for his master's degree, he lived in the northern Himalayas in Tibet and basically ate the same way these people ate, which was a very high fat, low carb diet. And then for his PhD, he lived in Papua New Guinea and ate the same way that those people ate, which was a high carb, low fat diet. And he talks about the effects that those diets had on his system and what he learned from those experiences. So we dive into all kinds of things about nutrition. We talk about meditation at the end and what an incredible positive impact it's had on his life, and so much so that he even now uses it as part of his wellness programs that he builds for people. So I really hope you get as much out of this conversation as I did. And so here is my conversation with Dr. Patrick Owen. So thanks a lot for doing this. And I'd like to start off maybe by just going through your background, because I think it's kind of interesting. I think that you come at nutrition from a very different angle. I think that you've had some interesting life experiences. And I think I'd like to start there, and then we can segue kind of into your more current philosophies and approaches to nutrition.
Sure.
Yeah, so just introduce yourself and let's get started.
Okay. So I'm Dr. Patrick Owen. I have a PhD in nutrition, and I'm a lecturer at McGill University. And how I got into the field that I'm in, which there's so many terms for it, but I call it ancestral health, functional nutrition, evolutionary nutrition or health. It really began with my master's degree. So at the time, what was really, really hip, I don't know if you remember the term, the French paradox. This is a dietary paradox, which is not a paradox. This is basically saying, how come people in France are eating so many baguettes, smoking so many cigarettes, drinking so much wine, and that their incidence of cardiovascular disease is so much lower than the rest of the world, right? So at that time, what was really sexy and hot in the field of nutrition were other dietary paradoxes. And my supervisor, Dr. Tim Johns, was looking at something called the Maasai paradox, the Maasai of the African tribesmen in Kenya. So the Maasai, their paradox was very similar. They ate tons of meat, tons of fat, very little fruits and vegetables, and yet no cardiovascular disease. Now, we've been told, all cardiologists will say that the best way to avoid a heart attack is to eat a plant-based diet, the more plants the possible. So why are we not seeing cardiovascular disease or diabetes or obesity in these populations which do the exact opposite? So for my master's, I identified another group in the world, Tibetan Highlanders. Tibetan Highlanders have very low incidence of cardiovascular disease. They live in very high altitudes, which means they have something called, they have a high polycrit level, which means that their hemoglobin is a lot higher because of the low oxygen. That means that their blood is thicker. That means that their risk, that's an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Not only that, but they eat tons of yak butter, meat, salt. They have butter tea, like the whole butter coffee thing. They started it with their butter tea. And they have very little fruits and vegetables. Basically, the only plant that they usually eat is the tea and barley. And so I went up to the highlands of Tibet and northern India to really analyze it to see what they use in terms of medicines. So I was looking at the plants from my botanical background into nutrition. And at the time, I was really trying to figure out the genetic component. Do they have like an immunity to cardiovascular disease? The aspect I was looking at was maybe they add some plants, like medicinal plants that can protect them from the horrible thing, from their horrible diet. Years later, I realized it's not a paradox at all. It's actually very much in line with our own evolutionary nutrition. I kind of confirmed that with a follow-up for my PhD, where I spent a year in Papua New Guinea. So up from the highlands, the Himalayas of Tibet down to the jungles, the hot jungles of Papua New Guinea. And then I compared traditional, like smack in the middle of the jungle, traditional Papua New Guineans down to a village that was connected to a road to the big city, and then in the big city. And I took the genetics aspect out of it because there was a settlement in the city that came from this village that was connected to the road, and that village from that road is the same, are descendants from that remote village. So they're all genetically parallel. And I expected to find that those who live the traditional lifestyle would have very low rates of diabetes and obesity. And then the one that's connected to the road would have higher, and then the ones in the city would have the highest. So what I found was almost that. Indeed, the one in the city had the highest. Obesity and diabetes, 44% of the population had it. That's scary.
Yeah.
The ones connected to the road had a beautiful mix of traditional lifestyle and traditional foods, but with city stuff, right? So we had lower rates, around 20%, but still there. The rural one really freaked me out because there was very low incidence of obesity, excuse me, but the same rate of diabetes. So we had diabetes in the remote community at the same level as the urban, but in the absence of obesity. And I found out that it's just because this is so new. This has only been happening in one generation, caused by 3 items that they've never been exposed to ever before: sugar, vegetable oil, and flour. Those 3 things. Those 3 things make donuts. So you find in the middle of the jungle, you'll find donuts. Well, their own variety of donuts. But if you think about it, donuts are ubiquitous. If I find them in the remote jungles of Papua New Guinea, and I have other anthropologists who find them in the middle of the Amazon, of the African continent, if we can describe a food that is ubiquitous to the entire human species today, it is donuts.
It's crazy.
Yeah, from Tim Hortons to Kit Castor to scones, really.
When I read your bio, you mentioned that another discovery for you was that you ate those 2 while you were there. You ate like they did, right? And so you ate a high-fat, low-carb diet while you were in the Himalayas, and then you ate a low-fat, high-carb diet while you were in the South Pacific.
Yeah.
And I think you saw the immediate differences in your own body, right? So maybe touch on that a little bit.
So when I talk about ancestral health, I have a client, I take their ancestry into consideration. Now, you and I are both from a Nordic ancestry, from our white skin and all. And so our ancestors were exposed to very harsh differences in climate, seasonal climates. And when I lived in the Himalayas, I felt good. Like I had this prejudice. I was there to look at this paradox. I was taught in school, like, you have to eat your vegetables, you have to keep your saturated fats low. And so I was seriously worried for my own health when I was drinking butter tea, and they put salt and butter, so much so that you have to blow on top of the tea in order to make a hole through the film of butter on the top, and then you drink it. The first time I had it, I thought, like, oh, it's gross. It feels, but I'm telling you, after a while, it's so nice and comforting against the cold and the wind. I was looking forward to it. With time, I realized that a lot of the things that I've been suffering for most of my life, bloating, constipation, asthma, they all kind of got better and better and better. When I first arrived there, and yaks are hairy mothers, right? They're freaking hairy. And I could feel my asthma coming on and my allergies coming on. And then I started eating like them, and then my asthma started disappearing. And I just felt good. And at that time, I still couldn't make the connection between the diet and how I was feeling, because again, I was so prejudiced. I was so like ingrained in that thinking. It was really when I came back home and I started eating back the way, and all those symptoms like constipation, asthma, acne, bloating, all these things came right back in. And like, listen, I was eating healthy. I was eating exactly like I was supposed to eat, right? Whole grains, vegetables, fruits, lean meats. So this is because, or the prevailing theory is because this kind of living is in line with my own genetic background.
Yeah.
See, my ancestors were meant to survive very efficiently during winter. And so during winter in the wild, there's nothing but hunting and fishing. There's no carbohydrates. There's no fruits or vegetables. Therefore, we've evolved to be really good at living on low carb. And when carb season came in, summer, especially late summer, that's when we'd be so efficient at storing those carbohydrates. Not only would we be so efficient, but we have a genetic drive to seek out those carbs, right? Because of a high dopamine response. And so this obviously is an evolutionary survival strategy. The more carbs I ate, the fatter I got. The fatter I got, the higher my chances of surviving winter, because winter is also food insecurity.
Right.
So what I was doing was basically emulating the dietary patterns of my ancestors. Even though I have zero Tibetan and Highland blood in me, the high altitude mimicked the Nordic latitude of my ancestors. And I saw the exact opposite in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea, they eat a lot of coconut, but they eat a lot of carbs. Sago, taro, plantain, mango, kind of low protein. Like there is protein, but it's very valuable. So they keep the protein for special occasions. Yeah, and I felt lethargic, bloating, fat, sick. And like I said, there were donuts there.
But they also have a low energy lifestyle, right? I mean, it's hot. They're probably not moving as much as where I would think the people in the Himalayas, because of the cold, because of the environment, they're probably more active. They're probably moving more. Does that tie into it at all? Like the activity levels are connected to the diet, but the diet's connected to the activity levels too, right?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Because there are some biological adaptations in the Tibetan Highlanders so that they can thrive at high altitudes.
Right.
For example, they have more microvascularity towards their limbs. They have a more barrel-chested torso in order to take in more oxygen. And again, it's the whole vascularity of it. So there are like adaptations, but these are adaptations that are somewhat hereditary, but that you and I can get as well, right? So like cold training and hypoxia, like we adapt by just becoming more efficient. But for them, through generations, and they're not the only one. There's even like in Ethiopia, the mountains, the ones who live in I can't remember the name of the mountain, starts with an S, whatever. But the generations that have lived there are actually genetically slightly different than their lower altitude counterparts, simply because they've just adapted.
Yeah.
So with Papua New Guinea, it's hard to say. There are human adaptations to it, but I'm not going to say like they're lower energy, because they are moving all the time. Like there are so many things to do. Like when I was living in the jungles, I could say that, yeah, they're living at the poverty level because everyone's working at less than $1 a day, but no one was starving at all. It's just like from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to work, it all has to do with procuring food. So they go to the gardens, they go to the fishing grounds, and it's always that. The entire day is all about something surrounding food or towards projects in order to increase their access to food.
Yeah.
So if I compare the energy levels between the two, no one did CrossFit, no one did exercise, no one sprinted or did really heavy work. They did what you and I would call LISS, low intensity, steady state exercises.
Yeah.
They would sit around. There's a lot of sitting, but it's only because that allowed it, because they were like threading something and everything. Yeah. So it's hard to say. It's really hard to say that there's difference in energy levels.
So I think what we could segue here is this idea of, there's a lot of words that go out now in terms of the way people eat. You eat keto, you eat paleo, right? And I think sometimes people get a little bit confused about what those things actually mean. Mm-hmm. Personally, I recently adopted what I would call a low carb keto style diet, where I'm basically trying to stay under about 20 grams of carbs per day, which means I've eliminated bread completely. I've eliminated sugar completely. If I am eating anything like, like maybe hummus or anything like that, where there is a little bit of carbs, then I'm factoring those into it. But I've been pretty strict about it. And it's mostly, a lot of seafood, a lot of vegetables, and that's about it. A lot of nut butters, a lot of high fat stuff. And I feel great. I feel really good. To be honest, I wasn't exactly, I'd gone gluten-free a long time ago. So it wasn't like a huge shift for me. It was more like just a few things that I had to get rid of. But I think there's a lot of confusion around those terms, right? Because people think, you're very minimized in what you can eat. What's the difference between paleo and keto? You mentioned CrossFit. I think CrossFit has already almost taken ownership of what it is to eat paleo or caveman style or whatever. So maybe we could kind of give people a little bit of clarity as to what those things mean, why they're good or not good for us, and how people can kind of introduce some of these ideas into their lifestyles.
Okay. So a good place to start is paleo, because paleo is a restrictive diet and you eliminate processed foods, sugar, vegetable oils, which are processed, and anything what they call Neolithic. So about 10,000 years ago, the advent of agriculture. So that means no dairy, no legumes, no grains. That is an elimination diet. Now, I give a course actually on the paleo diet, and I realized that that whole backstory about eating like the way our ancestors were is just nice in theory, but it's actually not. I've come to believe that that's not the main benefits of paleo. And I go through systematically why these foods are potentially problematic in the modern human diet. So I'm just going to go through it very, very quickly with the grains and legumes. Grains and legumes have a lot of anti-nutrients. They have toxic compounds, and this makes sense. When we eat plants are set out to, they don't want to be eaten.
They want to survive.
They want to survive.
Yeah.
Fruits want to be eaten. All right. So they want to attract a pollinator or a seed distributor, and things like with apple. Like, so ideally you eat the apple, we throw away the core, and then boom, another apple tree. So that's the way that the plant attracts it. But it never wants its seeds to be eaten. Never, ever. So things like nuts and seeds, they think they're protecting their seeds, their babies, with a hard outer covering, a mechanical deterrent. But when it comes to grains and legumes, it's a chemical deterrent. So we have gluten, oxalate, lectins, phytates, tannins, all these things. And their main goal is to prevent predation, herbivory, usually at the insect level, or worms or nematodes or whatever, and it will have a toxic effect on them. Legumes, for example, soy is the perfect example. They will actually mess up with your sex hormones. We know that these phytoestrogens are meant to mess up the sex hormones in insects. And if you think how cruel that is, or how ingeniously evil, the plant says, oh, you want to eat me? I'll make sure you'll never have children.
Yeah.
That's what phytoestrogens are. So every plant, psychedelic plants were in here in order to make you feel high and to feel, good. If we're in the woods, being high is going to increase your chances of having an accident, being eaten, fall yourself. So you have to understand from the point of view of the plant what they want. So grains and legumes, they do contain these things that are harmful to us. So these are out. So getting these out has a lot of health benefits. Dairy is a strange one, because we can get into the whole A1 and A2 aspect of dairy and what it means. But the good old fashioned dairy cow, the Jersey cow, has something called beta-casomorphine 7, which is kind of addictive. It has the morphine in it. And so this is why cheese is so addictive. And what we find that it increases binding to our opioids, and there's a couple of like biological issues here which are kind of troubling, because it seems that consumption of dairy products from A1 cows seems to be associated with autism, type 1 diabetes. And I'm putting question marks because this is still under investigation, right? Casein seems to cause cancer also. So if we look at A2 cows, like Guernsey cows and Holstein and other like the old world cows kind of thing, we don't have these problems. They don't have morphine-like qualities. And so that might be the reason why getting milk out. And of course, there's a whole lactose thing, and lactose intolerance, casein, milk can increase levels of IGF-1, which may cause cancer. All these things are just so gray and controversial that just kicking out of your body may have significant health impacts. We don't know.
That's the idea, right? With dairy, as far as I'm concerned, is okay, some will argue yes, some will argue no. The thing is if I cut it out of my diet, even if I'm wrong, it won't hurt me.
Exactly.
Right? Like it's one of those things, but if I do take it and it is not good for me, then that's when the problems happen. And I feel like dairy is one of those things where you can easily live without it.
Yeah.
You know, like, I mean, cheese is great. I get it. But I don't know if you've ever tried some really amazing nut cheeses, but they're really good. And, you know, I've been eating a lot of those. And I just think it's one of those things that you just have to get it out for a little while and then you kind of forget about it and you
Yeah.
just stop craving it. Right.
Yeah.
Another thing I noticed, maybe you can kind of touch on why this is since I switched and cut out mostly a lot of carbs for me were in the morning, first thing in the
Yeah.
morning. I'd eat a big bowl of cereal. I would eat, you know, I grew up on a big bowl of cereal followed by toast and jam. Like that was
Oh,
my, you know, that was my breakfast
me too.
up until the age of 20, easily.
With a
Right.
comic
So,
book. I also had
right.
a
So I
comic
would
book.
wake up. Yeah. I would wake up with this like hole in my stomach, just waiting to be filled with carbs.
Yeah.
And up until not that long ago, it's still how I would wake up in the morning. Not quite, you know, not the same quantities as when I was a teenager, but still. And since switching to, you know, sometimes skipping breakfast and trying to like intermittent fast a little bit, or even just having these high fat, low carb options, suddenly those hunger pains are gone. Suddenly that need to eat is gone. It's like at some point, I'm like, oh, I think I'm hungry. And I'll eat again, but at no point is there this craving or is there this like absolute need to eat. So what is it? What is it from like a metabolic perspective that's the difference there? Why is it that carbs make you crave more carbs very quickly as where fat doesn't really do that? Can we maybe touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, you bet. And I got two answers for you. So I'm going to pick on one, which is conditioned hunger.
Yeah.
So hunger, there's a lot of hunger, emotional hunger, biological hunger, and conditioned hunger, and several. But conditioned hunger is that if you do have breakfast at the same time every day, even if you're not biologically hungry, you're just used to eating, therefore you'll feel hungry.
Yeah.
It's the same thing when you're not hungry and you walk into a movie theater and you smell that popcorn and all of a sudden your stomach growls and like, I wasn't hungry a moment ago, but because I smell it and I associate movie theaters with popcorn, that's a conditional hunger. Conditioned hunger, excuse me. So by skipping breakfast on a regular basis, you deconditioned that need for it. So that's number one. Number two is the one that's really, really fascinating. I'm fascinated by this. Okay, so biological hunger. So biological hunger is on the premise that you are eating enough nutrients in order to get all the essential nutrients that you need, right? Now there's a lot of essential nutrients. Not only from, you know, protein, there's a lot of essential amino acids, there's 2 essential fats, there's vitamins, minerals, and trace minerals as well. There's tons, including oxygen for breathing and water. Carbohydrates are not essential. And I like to make the comparison with carbohydrates in alcohol. So say, for example, you have a lot of steak. You're not going to eat an entire box of steaks. I don't know how to say it, but like at one point, you're going to have so much steak, you're going to start having the meat sweats, you're going to start feeling ill, you're going to be like, oh, that's enough, done. So your satiety levels, your satiety signals, they're called leptoids, like leptins, and there's some mechanical stressors like the expansion of your stomach. These are all telling your brain like, yo, okay, we've had enough, stop eating. But when you have carbohydrates, because there's no essential nutrients, you can keep going and going and going. So we kind of escape the biological hunger need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. But what's the connection to alcohol?
So let's go alcohol. Alcohol is not essential. Let's compare it with water, right?
Right.
You're thirsty, you drink. But you can't drink and drink and drink and drink because at one point, because water is essential, your water is called homeostasis. There are feedback loops that's saying like, all right, you've had enough water, done. With alcohol, you can actually keep going because it is non-essential. What alcohol and carbs do is that it boosts endorphins. It makes you feel good. It's your automatic de-stressor. And we always associate carbohydrates and alcohol with, at the end of a day, like when you know, you find a difference in pace and things. And it's opposite too. So a difference in pace of your day is actually associated with increased carb cravings. So say like you're rushing in the morning, you have your cup of coffee, you get to work, and you're like, oh, all right, I think I'm just gonna have a snack before I get the day started.
Where's the donuts?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And the same change of pace, like I just got back from work, the kid's in bed, now I will legit have a carb craving. I feel like snacking and have a glass of wine. So change of pace is always associated with a need for an increase in endorphins, but it has nothing to do with essential nutrients. And this is why we can binge on carbohydrates until there's nothing left in the house. Seriously.
Yeah.
Right. You won't stop until you're like literally throwing up.
Yeah.
Same with alcoholics. So I'm not saying stay away from booze and stay away from carbs, but you have to understand that because there's an emotional connection to these substances, non-essential substances, that we really need to practice control.
Yeah.
And if we associate these things with an emotional connection, because as you mentioned, this breakfast cereal that you had since you were childhood, yeah, man. Like you talked to me about honeycomb cereals. And I think of honeycombs and all, like the taste comes with like happy memories of childhood, or hot chocolate on a warm day, on a cold day with homemade cookies. All these things are like, they bring up emotions of peace and calm and security. And that's an emotional attachment that can be harmful if I overdo it on any of those things.
Right.
Does that answer the question? The
Yeah,
fact
absolutely.
That they're not essential?
So essential, non-essential. So one of them is triggering an emotional response.
Yeah.
As where the other is triggering more of a biological response.
Exactly.
Right. One is like my body's saying, hey, we've had enough of this. We don't need it anymore. As where the other one is saying, oh, this is making me very happy. So let's go for more.
And
right?
This explains why people who live on processed foods are always hungry.
Yeah.
Because they're not meeting their nutritional requirements. You know?
So they're kind of messing with their nervous system at that point.
Your appetite. Yeah, exactly. Your appetite is never satiated because you're thinking, cripes, we're still low on vitamin B6. Let's keep that hunger
keep going until we get it, but you're never getting it. Therefore the hunger never goes away.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're binging on pizza and ice cream. And
yeah.
So
the next question I would have for you then is if we look at energy expenditure, right? Yeah. So one of the theories going around is that if I have a very high level, if I expand a lot of energy in my day, let's say I have a very physical job, let's say I'm a high level athlete who trains 5-6 hours a day, is there a carb requirement that I need to meet to fuel that system? Or can I still sustain those energy levels on a fat-based diet, right? Because that's when we're talking about, right? We're talking about, I know that, from the little bit of biology that I've done, that carb and fats both provide energy in a different way, right? Now, can I have a high level of energy output and still survive on a high fat diet, or do I absolutely need those carbs?
That's a great question. You can do it on fat, 100%. However, if you're an athlete and performance is an issue, you're not going to be as fat or as strong with a all fat diet until you train yourself to be that. And it can take months to get there. But yeah, fat adapted athletes is a big thing, especially in endurance sports.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got some athletes that are swearing by an all fat ketogenic diet.
But it takes time, right? I think it's because the transition,
adaptation,
and you're going to suffer for a few months in terms of your performance before you ramp it up again. Depends
on what your performance is.
Yeah.
So you can actually see real benefits with endurance sports. Just in a short adaptation phase. I'm going to say a month. You start hitting keto for a month, and you're a runner or a cyclist or a swimmer or a long ultra runner, whatever the case is. And then you're going to realize that like as you switch from a carb-based metabolism to a fat-based metabolism, you might suffer. You might go through a shitty time.
Yeah.
But eventually, at the end of the month, you feel like more aware, higher sustained energy levels, less of a mood swing. It's really incredible.
Yeah. And I think one thing that for me really turned me on, first of all, just to go gluten-free and to cut that part out immediately, was just seeing high-level athletes switching to the gluten-free diet and getting incredible. I think one of the first ones I noticed was the tennis player Novak Djokovic, who used to have, amazing player, but would always crash in the late sets, always had a hard time finishing because his energy levels were always dropping. Yeah. And then suddenly he starts winning championships and he's doing better. And one of the first things he mentioned was switching to a gluten-free diet and realizing that his body just wasn't able to process those things. And that's what was killing his energy levels. So these carbs that are supposed to give you energy, instead were sucking them away from him. And as soon as he made that switch, he started winning. And obviously there's mindset, there's probably a whole bunch of other factors, but I think we've seen more and more athletes switch to these types of diets. And to me, it's like, hey, if the best performers in the world are doing it, why shouldn't you, right? Like, even if you're not a high performer, become a high performer. Use this as a tool to become a high performer.
Does
that make sense? Yeah.
It does. Now, you have to understand, like, I do think that body type and genetics does play a role for it, For
100%.
example,
Yeah.
you and I have different body types, right? You're
Yeah.
the kind of guy, I bet you can eat way more carbs than I can and get away with it.
Externally, yes. Internally, less.
Maybe you're
You know, I
right.
think that yes, if I could eat carbs all day and probably not gain much fat, but I'll feel like crap, right?
Right.
Especially mentally. I feel it. There's like this mental fog. I'm sluggish. My energy levels drop. What I've noticed since cutting out a lot of carbs is my energy levels are way more, there's less peaks and valleys. It's
Yep.
more of this nice, even flow. And when I need more energy, it's
Exactly.
available for me. But then instead of crashing afterwards, I just kind of get to hover in this really nice state of this nice, even energy level. Is where before it was like, I'll load up on carbs, have enough energy to get through this thing, this workout that I want to do. But then, you know, mid-afternoon, I need to lie down for a while because
Exactly.
right? So that's where my difference, I guess,
See,
was.
I adore the simplicity at how you said that, the sustained energy.
Yeah.
All the stuff that I learned in nutrition and that you've learned, like I'm talking about all the classic nutritional stuff, macros, your calories, portion sizes, post-exercise nutrition, all this shit goes out the window
Yeah.
as soon as you go into a fat-based, because
Yeah.
all those rules only apply to if you have carbohydrates in your diet.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah.
So what happens is that if you cut carbs out completely, now you're going on a 100% biological hunger, not emotional hunger.
Yeah.
Now, when I'm talking carbs, sensitivity. Now you mentioned less than 20 grams of net carbs, right?
Yeah.
So there are some vegetables, like underground vegetables, like potatoes, sweet potatoes, radishes, and carrots like this that can contain carbs. We just don't know how sensitive you are genetically to carbohydrates. I know that if I was at 20 grams of carbs per day, I can't enter ketosis. I'm that sensitive.
It's too much for you.
For me,
Yeah.
yeah. And I know I have some clients who can get into ketosis at 75 grams, 100 grams, but the majority who are carb sensitive like me, who eat clean as much as possible, will always gain weight despite the fact that they're eating tons of vegetables. So we got to keep it down as low as 10, 15 grams, if that. And this is where things like the carnivore diet is like really successful for so many people, because that's more or less like a protein sparing modified fast.
Yeah. I think it depends also what you're doing it for, right? Like for me, the idea of entering
Yeah,
ketosis, and I'm not measuring my ketone levels. I'm like,
good.
I
Yeah,
don't need to. Like I'm just, for me, it's more how I feel because I'm not trying to lose weight. I'm not trying to reach any specific performance levels. I just want to feel good. But I guess
perfect.
if you are someone who really is trying to use this as a fat burning tool in order to lose weight, then you kind of have to be more precise in the way that you do it. Is that right?
Well, exactly. Like because keto has become so popular, they say like you need to count your macros in order to like really make sure you don't go above some certain grams of carbs. I like to simplify it. Like I have a program that just says just freaking drink butter tea or butter coffee. It's 100% saturated fat for your first meal. Now, let's be honest. Nutritionally, it sucks,
Yeah.
right? You're not going to get that biological. You're not going to address the biological hunger. But one thing about saturated fat is that fat does not enter the blood when it's digested. It actually enters the lymphatic system, right? It enters your lymph nodes. And say you just drank a butter coffee, you just basically just swallowed 4 tablespoons of pure saturated fat. That stuff goes into your lymphatic system and empties out somewhere in like the left part of the neck into the blood system, and it enters your fat cells right away. Now, when your fat cells receive all this pure fat in such a short amount of time, it excretes leptin, large amounts of it, to your brain and says like, holy crap, we just got in a whole bunch of high energy macros, fat, right? Just stop the appetite right now. So this leptin will actually not only shut down your appetite, but shut down all carb cravings, which is like the magic pill for so many people who are addicted to carbs and sugar. So saturated fat is not the villain that we made it out to be. I use it as a tool to first, let's get your carb cravings under control. Drink that fat. So you know what? You're not counting carbs. You're just freaking eating fat. And I think that that's the simplest way to get to keto,
Yeah.
or fasting. That's another great way to get to
Yeah,
keto.
absolutely. And I've played around with fasting, mostly intermittent fasting. I'm setting my goal to try like a full 3-day water fast at some point, just to see more for the mind than the body, I think. But even the body, I think that there's tons of evidence
Dude,
that says that it's
join us.
really good for
We're
you.
actually starting a 7-day fast this Friday. I'm not showing your
Interesting.
podcast. We're June 23rd right now.
Okay.
We're starting it. So Thursday night is going to be our
Interesting.
last meal.
Okay.
It's gonna be my second time doing it.
7-day water only.
Water, black coffee, tea,
Okay.
bone broth.
Like anything without calories, basically.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's a little too soon for me to try, but just the fact that you mentioned that is making it even more possible for me to try it later on. But when it comes to fasting, I've also noticed that even in intermittent fasting, when I first would wake up in the morning, I'd have those cravings because that's, biologically how I've been programmed. But then it was made very clear to me that hunger is a signal from the brain. It's not a biological need most of the time, right? Because, academically, I know that I can survive weeks without food if I need to in a survival situation, right? So
True.
why can't I make it for a couple hours? And I think
True.
as soon as you shift your mindset and realize like, hey, brain, I hear you. You want food. I get it. But I'm going to ignore that signal. Suddenly those signals go away much faster. Like the hunger's there and then it's gone. And especially if I keep busy and I'm doing things, my energy levels are actually pretty good. I've done workouts in a fasted state and perform pretty well. And I know there's a meal coming at around 11 o'clock. It's not like I have to do this for days and days. And I think that's it. I think that was the eye opener for me was, hey, hunger is just my brain signaling a craving for something. It's not a biological need, right?
100%. But yes, and this is why I love these extended fasts, because it completely deconditions your hunger response. And you're right, hunger comes in waves. And that's what our fear of is that once we start feeling hungry, we're almost all convinced that the hunger is going to get worse and worse and worse and worse if we don't address it. But it comes in waves. And worse is that hunger reaches its peak because of this hormone called ghrelin at 7:50 p.m. specifically for some reason.
Okay.
So I don't know, like this is when people usually get the munchies or an appetite around evening time. That's because, an appetite. So here's, if you do go on a low carb, ketogenic, high fat, low carb kind of diet, and you do end up having true biological hunger, you can actually get away easily with the OMAD, 1 meal a day or 2 meal a day at most. And that's because you have successfully tapped into your own stored body fat as a source of energy. Now, 1 pound of fat is 3,500 calories. That's way more than a day's worth of energy that you need. So yeah, you're not going to die, all right, biologically. But there are 3 things that we need to understand that set you up to fail. One is your gut bacteria. Your gut bacteria, depending on how you were eating before, let's say you were eating a lot of carbs, it affects the diversity of your gut bacteria. And if all of a sudden you decide to go low carb or fast, those bacteria are going to send signals to your brain thinking, hey, we're missing something here. So you need to time, this is why we call it fat adaptation. So you need that adaptation period in order to redistribute not only the diversity, but where it's distributed of your gut flora. The second thing is your metabolic enzymes. So say you have the metaphor of turning a car factory into a plane factory makes sense. So you're working on carbs and you just can't switch to fat right away. You got to change the machinery on the inside. So these are the enzymes. So you have special carb metabolizing enzymes, and you do take a while for you to shut down those enzymes and increase the enzymes meant for protein and fat breakdown. And then lastly is your brain chemistry, your dopamine, your serotonin, the addictive stuff that your brain craves. So this is why if you eat a carb-based diet, whether or not it's full of sugar, processed foods, or it's just a lot of salads and potatoes and rice, whatever, and you decide I'm going to start intermittent fasting, you might be setting yourself up for potentially binging behavior because you're not tapping into a fat-based metabolism. You're just kind of starving yourself a little bit. So in my opinion, if a person from my body type who's carb sensitive, who's susceptible to binging and carb addiction, yes, before you start doing any kind of fasting, let's get you fat adapted first. Whereas a person like you, no problem.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But I think also, it's just, for me, it's just the process of making this easy as possible, right? So start with switching to a keto-based diet. Now that I'm there, I can easily move into some intermittent fasting because it's going to be easier for me to do it. Then once I've done that, now I can start thinking about maybe trying a real fast and see how my body adapts to that.
That's it.
Right. And instead of going from high carb diet straight to fasting, I think that's where people
You're going
are
to
just going to,
suffer. Yeah, you're going to suffer.
And I think there's ways to minimize that suffering. Right.
Of course.
So I think we've covered a lot here in terms of nutrition, in terms of, how the body works. One thing that you posted recently is your new adventures in meditation.
Yeah.
And I would kind of like to segue into that a little bit because I think it all ties in, right? I think as someone personally who's been meditating for over 10 years and has had some pretty incredible experiences with it, one of the things that it helped me most with is that ability to deal with stress, to deal with the fear response, to deal with anxiety, and to deal with also the struggles that we go through both physically and mentally. So I think that, if you're someone who's helping and you help a lot of people, take on these new ways of eating and try to adopt these new lifestyles, I think meditation is just such a powerful tool to help someone do that because it gives you that sense of control over everything you're doing. So I'd be curious to know a little bit about your motivation to enter this world. And then secondly, what your thoughts are on kind of using meditation as a tool for anything else you're trying to do in your life.
Dude, yeah, meditation is the hardest thing that I've ever started doing. And I knew that I had to. But here's the pattern that I found in myself and as well as the majority of my clients is that we're overweight because of an uncontrollable appetite or addiction to carbs. And there's lifestyle things like we're always go, go, go. We're always watching a screen. We're always multitasking. We're always thinking of the things that we need to do. So I knew that meditation was something in order to fix that issue. And it was hard, frustrating. I would get angry, but I kept at it. And a few weeks later on, I got the epiphany. I got like, oh, I feel it. I'm making space in my brain to do it. So there's so many aspects about meditation that I love that I now include it as a necessity in my, I don't even give out pure meal plans anymore. They're lifestyle plans. Yeah. And it starts off with a morning routine, a nutrition plan, and an evening routine because it's this whole thing. So one, meditation, we know that it's part of the parasympathetic activity. And the parasympathetic nervous system, that's rest and digest. This is where humans, Homo sapiens, humans are supposed to live their day by day. But in our modern society with instant gratification and social media and Netflix and porn and video games and all this, like this constant stimulation, we're always in the sympathetic nervous system. And it's hard because it's addictive. We always want to be stimulated and we're afraid of boredom, which is crazy because when I was a kid, I read all the time. And your favorite TV show didn't come on until a specific time on a specific day of the week. Shit wasn't on demand. So we found that this addictive behavior is easily transferable to carb addiction. So meditation is a way to escape from that in order to really go in that parasympathetic nervous system. Reducing stress, obviously. Stress increases cortisol. Cortisol keeps insulin levels high, making it impossible to lose weight. All right. Obviously, I'm focusing on weight loss. So I'm looking at that aspect of meditation, but there's no doubt that meditation is amazing for the overstressed. And people who don't have time, you'll find that you have more time if you meditate, believe it or not.
Yeah.
But most importantly, and I think that this is something that I had a few weeks ago, where it was, I don't know how this happened, but I ended up meditating for 45 minutes. I was like a 5 to 10 minute kind of guy for the longest time, but I had this like soundtrack on, and as I got deeper and deeper, and it takes me now, I've gotten kind of better at it, about 10 minutes to get into to stop thinking about stuff. It takes me about 10 minutes. But as I got deeper and deeper, I felt like I was getting deeper into my subconscious. So we have 3 levels of consciousness. We have a conscious, I know what's going on. Your unconscious, breathing, walking, navigating, stuff like that we do, heart beating. And then we have the subconscious. And the subconscious is where the neural connections that we've made with our childhood, for example, like the epigenetic imprinting that we were talking about. So saying like, these childhood memories that I associate with hot chocolate, for example, because it brings me such pleasure, because the smell and the taste of it remind me of a time in my life when I was really, really happy as a boy. But the problem is that if I do it now as an adult, I can overdo it, which can cause harm. I'll get fat and sick. Meditation allowed me to actually explore this. And I don't know why I started thinking about this. Maybe it had to do with the sounds or the naturescapes or whatever. I had these music in my headphones. But the more time, without being distracted by the external world, and it takes practice. And I realized, like, damn, my emotional management toolkit is buried deep inside there. And it's all centered around food and comfort. And that meditation allowed me to really go down deep in there and think, okay, Pat, you've got a lot of work to do here.
Yeah.
Because we got to rewire all these things from your childhood. And listen, it could be a positive experience, like in my case with hot chocolate, or it could be a negative experience. And you gotta address these negative experiences, because it's almost like a story that's never stopped finishing. If you associate ice cream every time your parents got into a fight, and you associated like, well, they wanted me to, forget the fight by taking me out for ice cream, you may associate ice cream with negative emotions.
Yeah.
So it's important to finish that story and say, you know what? I forgive everything. I forgive my parents. I forgive them. I understand what they went through. It's not their fault. Yada. Just forgive. Forgiveness happens only in meditation. You cannot forgive when you're always moving, always moving.
Yeah.
Gratitude only happens in meditation. Listen, I say meditation, but it's just mindfulness, right?
It's
just
a state of consciousness. Yeah.
Exactly. It's
yeah.
just being aware.
So to tap onto what you're saying, through my studies, one of the things that blew my mind, literally and figuratively, is when you study meditation, which is a very strong parallel to flow states, right?
Yeah.
And flow states is something I could talk about for hours, maybe another time.
I'd love to, yeah.
Yeah, but there is this one state in flow state studies, which is called hypofrontality, which is the shutting off of the prefrontal cortex, right? So hypo meaning less, frontal referring to the prefrontal cortex. So when you're in a flow state being a state of peak performance, right? Where suddenly things happen automatically, where if you're an athlete, you're in the zone. If you're a musician, you're playing effortlessly without having to think about what you're doing. That is a flow state. That same state happens in meditation. But the reason it happens is because you're shutting off your prefrontal cortex. Mm-hmm. So if you go deep enough into your meditative state, what you described is suddenly there's this click where you're shifting your conscious state, which means you're no longer thinking about what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to have for breakfast? Oh my God, these things keep bothering me.
Yeah.
And what's happening is a different part of the brain is taking over. So you're shutting off that big part of the brain in front that we think as humans makes us so superior to every other creature on earth. When we're in our best state, it's off. It is turned off completely. Mm-hmm. And now we're transferring to what they call the reptilian brain, right? The ancestral brain. What you're talking about, those emotions, all of those things. And yes, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. I had a friend that I helped through meditation, and I taught her how to meditate. And one of the first things she was able to do was deal with this issue she's been having with her parents her parents died a while ago, and suddenly she was able to make peace with it because she went so much deeper than what her prefrontal cortex would allow her to do. Now, as to where those exist, I don't know. I don't know which part of the brain contains what, or even if it's somewhere out there, who knows?
The amygdala.
Yeah, right. But I think that what you're touching on is that. But in order to achieve that, I don't think you can do that in 5 to 10 minutes of meditation. Mm-hmm. I think that 5 to 10 minutes of meditation is great as far as managing stress, as far as giving yourself a mental break. All of that is very positive. But the reason you reached that state was because you went deep for 45 minutes. Yeah. Right. And that's where there's a shift that happens in your consciousness. For me, it was always around the 20-minute mark where there'd be this all of a sudden my body, I start feeling like I can no longer feel my body. So my connection to my physical self is suddenly not really there anymore. I'm thinking, but not really. There's this incredible sense of peace and connection that happens. And like you said, and suddenly you're exploring these new doors. You're opening these new doors of thought. You're allowing yourself to explore other possibilities. And it happens automatically. It happens, consciously, but there's no effort to it. And I think that that's where, you know, the power of meditation lies. And it's really cool that you've experienced that, because I think that's where people finally get it. They're like, oh, okay, this is what it's about.
But that's exactly it. See, I'm a freaking hyper logical, hyper scientific guy, all right?
Yeah.
And the way that I'm speaking now, had I heard me past me from last year, we were like, dude, you're a new age hippie dude. Like, geez, okay, go. All right, but the science is there, right? We know that there's benefits, and the way you're describing it is hard to understand if you've never tried it. And the reason why it's so important, just to start off with 5 and 10 minutes, is that consistency at least.
Absolutely.
Right? And make time for it. First thing when you get up, or last thing. I prefer it like first thing after getting up, or right before going to bed, because you're already like starting to be in a more relaxed state. But yeah, you're 100% right. I mean, for people who've never meditated, start with 5, start with the guided stuff on these apps. That's how I started. Yeah. And there are times when I was just checking my clock and thinking like, ugh, what a waste. And there's still days like that. Yeah. But when I had this epiphany, just like you, doors would open that I didn't want to explore these things. I have no idea. And you've been doing it way longer than I have. Yeah. So I don't know. I was excited. I would actually say that there was a moment of ecstasy.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And what's amazing is, especially again, when you look back at flow states, you're tapping into a very powerful neurochemical reaction. Yeah. You know, a flow state is like what they call a cocktail of 5 very powerful neurochemicals, which are dopamine, endorphins being morphine that your body produces, anandamides, which is a cannabinoid that your own body produces, serotonin that makes you feel so confident that you can do anything, right? Oxytocin, which is the love chemical, right? So all of those things come together in this powerful cocktail, which is flow state, which is that same state you're achieving in meditation.
Apparently you can even make your own DMT.
Yeah.
The body makes its own DMT.
Absolutely. So that's the thing, is it's all done endogenously, right? So you don't have to take those, because yes, I mean, there are benefits to that too. And there's a lot of amazing research going on right now where they're using, drugs like psychedelics and ecstasy to help people through some difficult things. Yeah. But, I think the day that you're able to do it for yourself, the day that you're able to produce these chemicals on your own, there's such a sense of peace that comes with that, because I didn't have to turn to anything to make me feel this way. This was all done just through effort and through practice. And if I could add one last thing to that, is a really great shortcut to achieving that state is combining meditation and exercise. Yeah. When you meditate immediately after exercise, we all know that exercise helps to produce some of those positive neurochemicals. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like you're loading yourself up on these powerful neurochemicals before you start your meditation process. I've also found that from a breathing perspective, the exercise kind of opens up my lungs a little bit. It gets my blood flowing. So when I'm trying to reach this deep breathing through meditation, I'm kind of already halfway there. Yeah. So it's kind of a little bit of a hack. If someone's looking to enhance their meditation experience, combining a short, high intensity exercise session with meditation can have some really, really powerful benefits.
And from an evolutionary standpoint, that makes complete sense if you think about it.
Yeah.
Because if you do chase a gazelle down or run away from a lion, yes, you're filled with endorphins and adrenaline and everything. But once you catch it, your body makes these like really endorphins so that you really become more relaxed in order to compensate for the excitatory response that you were just in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is why when you get like a fearful, when you're like super, super afraid or like shocked, and you have like this high, like, whoa, that was crazy. Oh, like this high. Yeah. That's all evolution.
Well, that's your fight or flight, right? And if your fight or flight can go in 2 directions though, because you can get that high, which is like, whoop, that felt great. Or you can freak out and go into PTSD, right?
Or trauma, yeah.
So you gotta but again, and I think meditation is going to help you figure out which direction that's gonna go, right? And for me, it's really my reason for entering the world of meditation was to help me deal with anxiety issues. I've always had anxiety. I've always had a hard time dealing with difficult things. I've always had a hard time dealing with fear and stress and all of those things. And it just slowly shifts your brain chemistry so that suddenly when those events happen, it's like, hey, I have a tool now. I'm able to deal with this. I know that if I just breathe, a certain way, I'm going to shift my neurochemistry into a positive direction. And knowing you have that tool in your back pocket gives you confidence. So suddenly sometimes you don't even need to do it because your body's like, no, we got this. We're good. right? And I think if you're bringing it back to nutrition, bringing it back to helping people lose weight and become healthier, when you're faced with that decision, should I make the bad decision and eat this thing that I know is bad for me, but I usually do it anyway because I'm really good at convincing myself?
Mm-hmm.
Or now that I have this tool that I can use to help me make better decisions.
Exactly.
Right? So I think that's where the power of meditation comes in.
You just added an endorphin releasing emotional management tool to your arsenal.
Yeah.
Instead of cookies or wine, now you have meditation that will also make you feel equally as good.
Amazing.
So the more diversity that you have in your emotional management toolkit, the better off you're long term. So forget about these fad diets that we're talking about, like the mental game.
Amazing.
So that's why meditation is, I will say, critical.
Yeah.
It is really critical. And all my clients, I push it and push it and push it now.
Amazing.
With great success.
So let's wrap this up. How can people reach you? I think you've delivered some awesome, I was on your website just this morning. You've got an extensive blog of information there. Let's just let people know how they can connect with you. And we'll take it from there.
Sure. My website is drpatrickowen.com. That's drpatrickowen.com. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Pat Owen. And you can call me up for 15 minutes and chat about your problems, and we can always work together. And like I said, I make customized meal plans, but lifestyle redesign plans as well.
Amazing. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I can't wait to share this with people.
Thanks, Pat. Take care.